Douglas, Sherwin mentioned some different ways that his clients are looking to create value in buildings. How have the new rent reforms changed the way you're operating your portfolio?
I think on the income side, it's going to be slow and steady growth over a much longer period of time. I think that on the expense side, people are going to look for all sorts of ways to save money to a point where they're not sacrificing services and their reputations. But that ultimately hurts the housing stock because capital's not being invested into it, which comes back to need some type of true systemic change to what they've passed. And then you talk about what's coming down in the next legislative session, and I think that begins to be a little bit of a scary conversation, which isn't helpful. But I think owners in general, the ones that we've spoke to, they're watching their pennies.
Right. And Karine, you mentioned the impact on supply and how that impacts the marketplace. To the extent that these current reforms stay around for a few years at least, and there is some form of encumbrances put on free market units, that is going to limit the entrepreneurial spirit or the entrepreneurial maneuvering that an owner can do on the revenue side of the ledger, which will relegate them to having to look at ways to save on the expense side of the ledger. From a macroeconomic perspective, is that something that is sustainable, and will that then shrink margins on property ownership down to a very, very small return if you're just focused on the expense side of things?
Right. It'll definitely shrink margins to the point that people will reconsider or consider other options. But as far as the quality of the product, it's a hard argument to make when there's a high quality product not too far away. And that's the concern of the New Jersey versus New York. Right across the river, if capital is flowing out of New York into New Jersey, that product quality is going to be able to be a lot better and a lot higher. So, and realistically, New York rent, it's not getting cheaper because of this regulation. So even in terms of the renters themselves, how much are they going to hang in there for? If we're talking about the long-term concerns, if there's a market correction tomorrow, are these renters really going to hang in there, or are they going to fly too?
And that's one of the unintended consequences, is if the supply is constrained because units are not being rented, that actually will exert upward pressure on free market rents. So do you see that pressure creating issues within the marketplace?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the pressure's going to be there.
Okay. Sherwin, you mentioned that part of the way to create value now in buildings under the new guidelines is to do apartment combinations or change exterior walls of units. Could you, for those in the audience that are not familiar with the way to do that, could you explain generally what the guidelines are relative to those combinations?
Sure. So rent stabilization works on the notion of a rent history. You build upon the history of the existing apartment. What if you create a new apartment so you've wiped out history? That's what Bob is referring to. So if you have a 2-bedroom apartment next to a studio and you create a new 3-bedroom apartment, you combine them, you've created an apartment that never existed before. It has no rent history. Therefore, you can now create history. You can create a first rent. Whatever you want to charge becomes the legal rent. It's rent stabilized thereafter, but it's your one opportunity to get a significantly higher rent to get to market, although regulated thereafter. You can also, there's case law that indicates you can take a large unit and divide it, making smaller units, and then have, again, 2 first rents. The rule is that the new apartment needs to be qualitatively different than what existed before. So if you're making a unit bigger, it's not enough to add the superintendent's closet onto the apartment. A 2-by-2 increase is not a qualitatively different apartment. A rule of thumb that's often used is a 10% increase in the footprint, but that's not hard and fast. It needs to be qualitatively different. not changing the footprint, just moving the partitions around, that's not a new apartment. And by case law, if you are making smaller units, my suggestion is that the unit not have the same number of rooms as existed previously. So at least one case where an owner had a one-bedroom apartment, shaved a portion of the one bedroom off, put it onto the apartment next door, but essentially kept the one bedroom with a small difference in square footage. And the appellate court said, no, we don't think that's really qualitatively different. So it's kind of, you want to be able to look at two drawings and say, you know, this is really different than what existed before.
And Sherwin, what about popping up to the roof to create a duplex, popping into the basement to create a duplex?
Yeah, I mean, duplexes, interior staircases are becoming very popular. Anything you can do that changes the square footage so that it is a qualitatively different apartment than existed before, you now have a first rent. There's one attorney that has offered the opinion that if you take a market rent apartment and combine it with a stabilized apartment, that you now have a first rent and a market rate unit. It's free market. I don't agree. Since there's no more deregulation based upon high rent, I don't know how you create a new deregulated unit. So I think even if you take a market rate unit and combine it with a stabilized unit, you've now got a first rent, but you have a stabilized apartment. It's my opinion. Have not seen any decision on it as yet.
Okay, Douglas, clearly these new rent reforms haven't exerted upward pressure on property values. There's no real data in the marketplace to determine how much negative pressure has been put on values because we just haven't had enough data points. We're still in price discovery mode. There have been only a handful of transactions on multifamily properties in the city where contracts were signed subsequent to June 14th that have closed. There are some, but not enough to be statistically significant. But given that the perception is that values are lower, how has your world dealing with bankers changed? What are you seeing from the banking community in terms of how they might be changing their perspective on the market? Are there things they're asking for now they weren't asking for in the past? And what is the process of getting financing on properties? How has that changed in the wake of the new regime?
I think for the traditional lenders, the signatures, New York community banks, Capital Ones, I would say before the regulations, they were kind of in the 60-65% loan-to-value range. They were looking at coverage, very little interest only. I think given the drop in prices, they're still at those numbers, and they probably feel a whole lot better about the loans that they're making. And rates have come down, which also that helps.
Yeah, thank goodness that rates are where they are. I mean, that is you wonder what things would be like in the market if rates were 100 or 150 basis points higher. If we look at the one thing that I think was so impactful about how well the MCI program and the IAI program worked was that it incentivized the private sector to deploy hundreds of billions of dollars into the housing stock to increase the quality. And motivating the private sector, I've always said if you put the right incentives in place, the private sector will do pretty much anything you want them to do. But Karen, if the marginalization of the MCI and the IAI program create or eliminate the incentive for the private sector to invest in the housing stock, what is likely to happen to the housing stock, and what are the implications of that?
Sure. I mean, the quality is just going to suffer, and New York saw a period where buildings were not being maintained properly, and the MCIs were supposed to assist with that. So it's almost, we almost have to consider if we're going backwards in terms of quality and how much incentives the landlords have to properly maintain buildings.
Excellent. So Susie, as we've discussed, supply is key. To the extent there's stress in the market, residential vacancy rates are so low, which is what created this emergency in the first place. We need new supply. One of the big concerns within the industry is that with these restraints on being able to increase rents and potentially, as Sherwin mentioned, encumbrances that could be placed in the next legislative session on free market units, we need more supply to help the market. So I've often said that in order to stimulate development, that having the state lift the 12 FAR cap on residential construction would be a first step. But secondly, maybe increasing the FAR for a residential rental building, maybe doubling it from what it is today, with permanent deed restrictions so the building couldn't be converted, and maybe a real estate tax cap per square foot. And again, the industry and the government have such a unique ability to do something that works for both sides, because from the city's perspective, the city cares about real estate taxes per tax lot. The industry cares about real estate taxes per square foot. There's a way for a win-win scenario there. But if you were to, I assume, Susie, you'd rather build a rental building than a condo building, right? Every developer loves that, but land is just so expensive you can't do it. If incentives like that were put into place, what kind of impact do you think that would have on the supply of rental housing in New York?
I think it would really change the economics, because even if the land prices continue to be high, you're getting additional incentives, which really makes the projects, multifamily rentals, more viable. If the city expanded the VIH, right, to be all over the city rather than very specific locations as it currently allows, so, and also increased density, right now, it's typically for 20%, you get 30% additional FAR, free FAR, so there's a little bit of a vig there. But I think if you actually change that ratio to be higher, so for every 20%, you get 40% additional density above that 12%, I think it changed the economics. The other part is also things like allowing quality housing to be deployed all over the city instead of very strict zoning districts. The things that you have to build for your tenants, like the amenities, it doesn't count as zoning. All of those things are carrots or incentives that you can offer to developers to create more affordable housing. And those could be done where the VIH and the quality housing could go hand in hand, right? So you can't do it for sale housing, but you can do it for multifamily rentals with affordable. Those are hugely impactful opportunities that the city has and city planning has to really affordable housing development.
Yeah, and it's something that would really change the market. I think you could literally, with the right incentives, you could have hundreds of thousands of new apartments built in the city, which we desperately need. I mean, the fuel that makes the city go is the fact that people from around the country and around the world want to come live in New York and come work in New York. We need a place that's affordable for those folks, that's affordable for the folks who really make the city run, the auto mechanics, police, firemen, people who work in bakeries. Those people, it's almost impossible to find a place to live that's affordable in the city. And with enough supply, that would decrease the stresses that we have on the system. And there is absolutely a win-win between the city and the industry to have the city get more tax revenue and real estate taxes per square foot to be kept in check. So that's absolutely a possibility, and we have to really push to try to get those incentives put into the systems.